Chat away.
Okay, Chris. Chris Kappas, who's been a lifelong resident of Blacksburg, whose father was the famous owner, restaurateur of the Greeks restaurant, which
Of the original Greeks.
everybody who came to Blacksburg, it was probably in one of the few places to eat. Why don't you talk about your father and how your father got here?
Tom, it really is a long and it's a beautiful story. I hate to use the word a typical immigrant on the American dream, but I'm not sure when my father came to this country. He was 13 years old in 1913, and left parents in Greece, siblings. And I don't know whether there was a great migration back then from Europe. I think after the Civil War, when a lot of people came into the industrial machine from 18-something, and then there was a big one in the early 1900s. But you heard of America, I don't know how. I don't think back then they had any sponsors to come here. I think America just needed immigrants to work.
Yeah.
And at 13 years old, I can't imagine having that kind of courage.
Me neither.
To get on a boat for a month plus to come to the United States. Landed on Ellis Island, went through the lines wherever they went, and he was afraid he was going to be turned back because there was a lot of sicknesses, tuberculosis, that type of thing. But they turned it back. His name was Kappas, and a lot of people had these difficult names, and they changed them right there on Ellis Island. But it was Kappas. I think they felt that anybody can pronounce that name.
Yeah.
So he passed through and didn't know where to go. Heard of maybe some Greeks in Erie, Pennsylvania, that were in the railroad business. Got on a train, went to Erie, did not like it at all. Heard of some Greeks called in Roanoke, Virginia, who were from the same province in Greece that he was from. Left Erie, I think he was there maybe a couple of months, I'm not sure. And I'm trying to recall this from what he told me.
Yeah.
And of course, I never recorded our conversations like we're doing here.
Sure.
And wound up in Roanoke after a while. And found a job in Salem, Virginia. Most of the Greeks then were down in the city market of Roanoke. And one of the stories that he tells when he first got there was the first job he ever had was in Salem making homemade ice cream with his hands. He would get on a bus from his apartment at the city market in Roanoke to go to Salem, maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes away back in those days. No English. And as he approached Salem, there was a sign there on the city limits. After a while, I began to understand and learn a little English. And the sign says, "Welcome to Salem, Virginia. No foreigners. No Jews." You may want to edit this. "And no in people allowed."
Yeah.
He learned to keep his mouth shut. And finally wound up with one of his friends working in downtown Roanoke. He left he left the ice cream shop and then worked for one of the Greek restaurateurs there in Roanoke. And that was from 1913. He stayed in the Roanoke area to 1921. And the question is, how did he come to Blacksburg?
Well, let me ask you before we get
Okay.
to Blacksburg.
Sure.
What was was your father thinking at 13 years of age to say, well, I'm going to leave Mom and Dad and...
That's a great question. I think what he was thinking of, that he wanted to get here and help his family. That was in dire poverty in Greece. And probably the only thing that they had was little bungalows, little houses they had lived in, and some livestock, mostly goats.
So really, there was nothing for him in Greece.
There was nothing there. And this is the central part of Greece, very mountainous. You think of Greece and the Greek Isles and Athens, but Greece is very mountainous above, for about 100 miles above Athens. And there was just nothing there.
Did you meet your grandparents?
I'm sorry?
Did you meet your grandparents?
I never met my grandparents, but I met my dad's sister when I went to visit Greece several years ago. They were still alive. But his family's all gone now. But I never met them.
So as a child growing up, you didn't, they didn't come here?
No, absolutely not. I first, when I came from Greece, I was 9 years old. And right out of high school, I visited Greece for the first time since I had left.
So you were born in Greece?
I was born in Greece.
I didn't know that.
Which is another story.
Yeah. Well, let's stick with your father for right now.
Let's stick with my dad for a while.
So he's in Salem for 8 years.
He was in the Roanoke area, in the city market.
In
the
market,
city market, above the same building where they remodeled. He had a little apartment upstairs.
So he's 21 now.
He's what? Yeah, almost
21, 22, something like that. Yeah.
And he heard of Blacksburg. For some of y'all who may not know, that Virginia Tech, back in those days, was called VPI, and VMI played a football game on Thanksgiving Day called the Military Classic of the South. I don't know if you remember it when you got here.
That was before my time.
Before your time. Anyway, it was an annual football game, and cadets from both schools, Virginia Tech and VPI, was predominantly a military school, and we had some civilians coming in from the war and all that sort of stuff. It was about 2,800 cadets. And during that game, the cadets would come downtown and march from downtown area to the stadium called Victory Stadium and play the football game. Well, anyway, in the end, the cadets had somewhere to go to eat. We were going to all these little restaurants, both VMI cadets and VPI cadets. And the VPI cadets would go into this restaurant that my father was working at the time downtown Roanoke, and got to know the employees there and who they were. And finally, after a couple of years of this game, somebody says, Nick, you need to come to Blacksburg and open up a restaurant. He says, where's Blacksburg? Where it was. Again, one day I decided to come and check it out.
Yeah.
Got on the bus. I'm not sure he had a car. No, I don't think he had a car. He came to Blacksburg. And in 1921, he decided to stay and open up a restaurant. And I think his first restaurant was on Main Street right next to the post office, or downtown post office. And then he settled in on what is now as a Settle restaurant and opened up a
So that would have been in the early 20s,
That would have been early 20s. And he called his restaurant the Busy Bee Restaurant.
Oh.
But the locals never called it the Busy Bee Restaurant. It was always a restaurant that the Greek owned.
The Greeks, yeah.
The Greek owned.
Yeah.
Decided later on to get a partner from Roanoke. The guy came up and he liked what he saw, and his name was Louis. So they had to change the name from the Busy Bee Restaurant to Louis and Nick's restaurant, the L&M Lunch. I think I still have the sign somewhere, but I'm not sure I can find it. Again, nobody called it the L&M Lunch. It was the restaurant that the Greeks owned. And after Louis died, called it the Blue Ribbon Restaurant. changed the name again. Again, nobody called it the Blue Ribbon Restaurant. It was the restaurant that the Greeks owned. And later on, when we came into the business and another part of the family came into the business, we decided to change the name from the Blue Ribbon to the Greeks. And since then, the new owner does not have the Greeks cellar on there or the Greeks restaurant. He's just got it the Cellar Restaurant. And that's how the name evolved over all these years.
Now, when did you move into the old Greeks building, one where
That was about 1922 somewhere.
So he moved into that pretty quickly.
Oh yeah. I think he stayed on Main Street at post office for a few months, maybe a year.
I see.
And then he moved down the street to where the building is now. So it wasn't very long.
So he bought that building? And
He bought that building. He bought it, yeah. And I think later on he had other relatives that were part of the interest in the building also. So there was a lot of changes. After Louis came in, and then a cousin of his came in named Jim Kappas, and he had part of the building at one time. But in 1936, 37, when Louis was still a partner, my dad is a good friend of his out of Welch, West Virginia, George Sagers, good friends. They decided, they were 40-some years old, they decided to go back to Greece and get married.
huh,
Go back to the provinces where they were from,
yeah.
and maybe find a Greek girl, marry him, and bring her to the United States. So as soon as they got over there, villages, remote villages, the locals heard about these Americans, Americani, looking for a bride. My father was 41, 42 years old. And the old saying from Fiddler on the Roof, matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match.
Yeah,
Well, this was true with my dad.
yeah.
My mother was almost 19 years old when he met her. She didn't want to marry him because he was too old. There were about 22 years difference. But grandmother, with her vision, said, you're going to marry this guy, you're going to go to America, and you're going to live well. What she didn't say was, you're going to take care of us too. Anyway, married mother, and came back to the United States to do the necessary paperwork for her to come over. Left mother, they're pregnant with me. I was born in 1938, and unfortunately, there were two guys named Mussolini and Hitler who had other ideas about Europe. World War II started, and the blockades, so we couldn't come over here. I was born in Greece, an American citizen, because my father was a naturalized American citizen, and couldn't get here till after the war started, was over. Greece really did not want to get into the war, but anyway, we didn't want to get into the politics. So the war was over in 1944, 45. By the time all the necessary paperwork was done and everything, we came over in 1947, I believe. My mother and I.
Wow.
She came over on my papers, according to all the letters I got from the State Department and Dean Atchison and all that sort of stuff. So
you were 8 years old then?
I was
9 years old.
I met my father the first time, Brooklyn Navy Yard, where we landed.
I'll be darned.
For some reason, we have to go through El Salvador, I don't know why. Anyway, and they're on the boat on the road, and my mother says, there's your dad down there. And I remember that. She pointed to him, and I was a little short fellow that was the first time we met my dad.
It's almost surprising she remembered him after 9 years.
But that's how I got to the United States. I was born in Greece, and I came to Blacksburg in April, and I started grade school, first grade, down here on Draper Road.
Oh, yeah.
And the gentleman that you met, his father was the principal of the school then. And he had to start me in the first grade because I didn't know any English.
Well, I was going to ask about that if you were...
No English, no. And
Your mom didn't speak English
oh
either?
no, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Even until later on in life, that she understood. She spoke. You remember my mother?
Yeah, I do.
At the cash register.
Yeah.
And she had a difficult time, very difficult. So I don't recall. We were probably the only, maybe a couple of other families. Dr. Lowe and his family came in later on. That were foreigners. And it was tough.
Yeah,
Tough. In Blacksburg, going to school with kids that you didn't know, and you had an accent, I had an accent,
sure.
make fun of you.
Yeah. But by that time, your father's business here was very well established.
My father's business was well established. It was a local business. It was the blue plate special type of thing.
Yeah.
Where you had meatloaf and 2 vegetables or whatever. They had breakfast. And no alcohol because of prohibition.
Yeah.
And that's another long story. But he worked hard. He worked hard. 18 hours a day.
Yeah, it was quite. I think that well, when I came to Blacksburg in '71, there was still no liquor by the drink.
That's when we opened up the cellar.
I think you could get beer.
The alcohol thing, because of prohibition, they repealed that, 1930, I think?
Yeah.
He decided with his partner Louis to get an alcohol license. And he applied, and it was turned down by the Ministerial Association in Virginia Tech. Have I told you this story?
No.
And they turned him down, and he applied a second time. The same thing happened, turned him down again. After a while, 1931, I believe, he says, I got to talk to somebody. You want to talk to the local ministers? They were all Baptists. So he goes, from the story he tells me, takes his apron off at the old Greeks, crosses the street and goes all the way to Burris Hall. I think it was Dr. Burris or Dr. Newman. I don't recall who the president was. And he introduces himself to the president of the university. Says, my name is Kappas. I own the Blue Ribbon Restaurant or the L&N restaurant downtown. And I want to apply for alcohol, for a beer license and a wine license. And if you will permit me to do that, and if I have a violation of any type, I will not reapply again. I will abide by the laws. He finally got his license.
Mm.
And he had that up to the time, and he always sold it off limits, by the way. He never sold alcohol on the premises. It was always off limits.
So it was carry out.
That was carry out. But he had a license to sell all. But it was always out. And when we remodeled the restaurant with the rest of the family, which is another story we're going to get into later, I wrote a letter to the Collegiate Times and the Virginia Tech newspaper. And I wrote a letter to Dr. Harm, I think, saying that we were going to exercise our license to sell on. And we went underneath the restaurant, and we wanted to do an original Greek taverna or Greek tavern that they had in Athens back in those days. And we remodeled it. And with the help of architectural professor Olivia Ferrari, who helped us design it, we did the Greek cellar underneath the restaurant. That was in the early 70s. So they're advertising 50 years old, but actually the restaurant goes back to 1921.
Yeah.
And it was very successful. And a lot of alumni, and met their future wives there, and just a great gathering place.
The first story I ever heard about the Greeks when I was in graduate school in Knoxville, Tennessee. One of my fellow students, when he found out I was taking this position at Virginia Tech, he said, "Well, you got to go see the old Greek." Because I didn't know anything about the old Greek. And he says, "Yeah, that's just the best thing." He had come here, I guess, taking some programs in the summer during the 60s.
Right.
But he said you'd go down to the old Greek and you could sit and drink beer in there after hours.
That's a cellar.
No, this is before the cellar. This had been in the 60s. So the impression I had was that your dad would invite some people back into the back of the restaurant in the kitchen or something, and then sit around and have a beer or two with people.
Well,
If you want to time out there for a minute.